Hey, how's it going? It's 6:21 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's April the 14th. They tell me it's the year 2023, and you be the judge. I know it's been a long time since I've produced anything, really, other than maybe some Facebook posts, but yeah, there's a good reason for that. There's a lot of reasons. I don't know, some are better than others. I reach points that I like to call, they're sort of plateau points. The way I describe this is how I've always actually learned in the past. It's not like a steady incline. You go up a hard incline and you hit a plateau. And then you travel on that even ground of that plateau until you hit another hard incline. And then you have to surmount that to get to the next plateau. So that's basically my allegory for learning. And because of that, I've been on quite an incline lately. With a lot of other things, just absorbing some things that I haven't had to absorb before. Working a lot on the Bible versus Middle East book. A lot. Have a lot of it not finished, but a lot of it pretty well done. Just in the sense of figuring out what the best topics are for volume 1, because it can't be one book. There's far too much to it. It has to be a number of volumes. That would be the only way to do it. And then coping with still physical things from the chemo and everything that haven't been addressed yet. Getting used to new medications. Because for 2 years, I've done everything I can to not use medication for especially the neurological problems that either developed or just have been greatly augmented since the chemotherapy. And so there's that. Now, I did want to let everybody know. Because I've had good, faithful patrons for some time, people who have been supportive in a number of ways for a while. I'm doing everything I can to try to organize, and I've been getting advice, I think good advice, on organizing. So one of the things is I'll be sending out a regular email, for one thing, and to anybody who wants to get on the email list. And I will set that up. You can, in fact, if you want to, in this video, I always have in the information the email list, not the, I guess on my old videos I still have that jmachtemes11@gmail.com. That's kind of like more of a personal email. And a lot of stuff goes there that I don't pay a lot of attention to, because a lot of like business and personal things go there too. But it's the john@oberyproject.info. That's always listed in the recent videos. If you send me an email, just tell me to add you to the mailing list. I'll put you on the mailing list, and I will start just a regular email to let you know what's going on. Just so that you know what's going on. Whether you're a patron or not, or considering, or you're following, whatever it is. And yeah, I know there are some people that they're pretty annoying with their email lists. That's not my purpose. Unfortunately, I'm still on a few mailers that are just headaches, really useless stuff. And I haven't gotten around to just telling them, take me off your list, because you give me a headache. So since I haven't really had really haven't had topics that I thought, well, this is a good topic. I think it's complete enough for a brief. And because I do want to try very hard to get regular and consistent, at least briefs out there, besides the fact that I am working on a lot of extra content in different mediums, I thought, well, why don't we do this? And I have the free dictionary by Farlex up because I'm on the definition for the word catatonia. I think my brain is experiencing a catatonic state. Not really my brain. It's just literally like creatively. I'm working so much on, well, actually a new biglyphs root table, which is super involved. It all has to be manual. And the book and those other things that, you know, I feel a little catatonic when it comes to everything else. So what I have open, and I'll hit the borrow button here in a minute, is a book that I've owned for, I probably had it for, 4 months, maybe 6. And I've been slowly working through it, really slowly. Because it's one of those books that, like almost every other book that I'm presently aware of, like everything out there, you have to carefully go through it. You have to be careful what you take for granted or believe by these writers. They wouldn't tend to be widely published if they were telling you the whole truth, or really digging into the sources that they have available to them. So you have to read between the lines a lot. You have to pay attention to all they write in all of the sections that they write in, because oftentimes they tend to say things that are strangely contradictory. Unfortunately, again, this is virtually all books. It's virtually all books. And Marilyn Irvin Holtz, The Orphan Trains, Placing Out in America, is no different. There's a methodology. I'm finding this methodology in virtually every book I get on any subject. And to tell you the truth, that this is one thing I think that is very, very good advice for anyone out there wanting to look more deeply into any given topic. Do yourself a favor. Save yourself a lot of time. And for the most part, unless we are talking about somebody who is a party that you are very familiar with, you find they are very trustworthy as far as them giving you as much as they possibly can in a very sincere fashion, just stay away from books that their subject is conspiratorially fashioned. Okay? So, I have so many of them in my digital library, and I have to tell you that those are some of the biggest wastes of time. You know, now, not all of them, and of course not all conspiratorial authors are created equally as well. Some of them will give more as far as some solid information that you can anchor on and go from there. Start off as a jumping point. And these oftentimes show up just in the form of footnotes or brief passing citations, things like that. You might find those. Typically, you're oftentimes better off getting books by more mainstream type of sources, ones that are not necessarily implying something conspiratorial, but in my opinion, they would be people that are looking to sanitize, maybe sanitize a topic, make it seem a little bit more benign, which is mostly what you're going to see mainstream sources do. So with a topic like the orphan trains, that is a subject that has to be heavily sanitized, because if we just look at the facts, and by the way, this book by Marilyn Holt, The Orphan Trains, it actually is full of facts, just in the sense of small, raw data points, which, as I said, I've been going through, underlining, oftentimes taking notes on, sometimes copious notes on, because it's those small data points that let us know far more about maybe the nature of what was going on, rather than if somebody had written a book claiming it was a conspiracy. Let's say they'd written a book, or they have a YouTube channel or a podcast or something, and they decided that what they thought was the best reason for this proliferation of orphan trains, predominantly in the 1800s and early 1900s. The early 1900s part of it seems to mostly be in the U.S., the early 18 and mid-1800s portions of it in Europe, but it was still going on in Europe in the early 1900s up to World War II. It really, anything that was going on as far as shipping around certain demographics of people by way of train and other, not just train, I mean, they were shipped around in every way possible, just heavily on trains. It was going on in Europe and the U.S. consecutively, both. So if it's relatively tracked 1850-something to about 1920-something in the U.S., well, first off, it was going on later than the 1920s in the U.S., but it was also going on in Europe in those years. Remember, this same thing, the removing of children from their parents, was going on in Europe as late as World War II under the auspices of getting children to safe places. The National Socialists did it, the Brits did it, and who knows how many other countries participated in this sort of thing one way or another. They don't advertise it. Now, it appears from what I've read in Holt that a lot of this information is retrievable, probably not exhaustively retrievable, because as she says many times throughout this book, a lot of the records regarding just innumerable individual cases, for one thing, and that's just in the Children's Aid Society of New York. They lost track of innumerable orphan cases. But the Children's Aid Society, that, like all roads seem to lead to Rome, and Rome is the Children's Aid Society. The reason for this, in my opinion, is because the Children's Aid Society is essentially the public face of this whole operation. They are who most would point to as being, the one central organization. But as Holt has revealed, even in, I'm only just past halfway through this book. What she has revealed time and time again is that there was a huge amount of organizations that either still remain unknown in general, current writers who are now fictionalizing these things or dramatizing the orphan trains, which is a pretty common tactic to get our attention away from the facts that we should be focusing on. They dramatize it. There's a woman now who's been doing this and giving a lot of talks. You'll probably find her if you just put orphan trains into a YouTube search, and don't remember her name, I'm sorry. But that's what's going on. And very few people, of course, are talking about not only the fact that on record, the numbers of these orphans just in the United States. So right now I don't have on record even a close estimation of how many of these children, this happened to in Europe. Just in the United States, it's amazing, just the official numbers, and just through the Children's Aid Society, hundreds of thousands. And again, that doesn't count all kinds of different so-called charities, organizations that were doing this too, all almost without fail under the guise of Christianity. Catholic, Protestant, you name it. Every denomination participating in this sort of thing makes it look really benevolent, doesn't it? The fact is that the sheer numbers of just how many children were taken from their parents and just how many parents of these demographics, and I will talk to you about the demographics, that were killed in some way or another, institutionalized in some way or another, rendered unfit to be parents in some way or another, talked out of their children, maybe in some way or another, gave up their children because they were, who knows, addicts living very hard lives. I mean, there were morphine addicts 100 or so years ago, alcohol addicts, other kinds of addicts, living very hard, desperate lives, maybe giving up their children in that way too. But I'm saying all this just to make the point that the numbers, first off, the numbers that we have are mind-boggling. And secondly, the numbers that we don't have are suggested to be far, far greater than mind-boggling. Let's say you were somebody who thought that a good reason for all of this was because of some sort of catastrophe that took place a couple of centuries ago, and that certain people somehow seized power after this catastrophe and decided to ship children all over the place and not telling them about this great catastrophe. You know exactly what I'm talking about. This is inextricably linked with this whole idea of mud flood and Tartaria and reset. These people saying these very odd things about why they think that so many orphans existed at certain times and were shipped all over the place in Europe and America at certain times. But what they can't answer is why, and we'll see, why such a very, very, very high percentage demographic-wise were, high percentage of these children were a certain demographic. Certain demographic. Not all children, they don't have answers for that. These fucking shysters that they are. They don't have answers to why they were a certain demographic. And that sort of illustrates why you have to be careful of any of the outlets that are approaching these things from a conspiratorial mindset. Because, unfortunately, I wish I didn't have to say this, I think they are often a far greater waste of time than just getting some books that are basically establishment, popular narrative, Reason being, you're oftentimes going to get better citations, like just stronger, let's just say, more solid, strong citations that you can anchor on and use as a jumping off point to go and there's just no easy way to do this, to go and find out all that you can on your own. We can't read anything anymore without being on our guard. We can't watch anything anymore without being on our guard. And I mean anything. I don't just mean conspiratorial videos. I mean anything. We can't listen to anything anymore without being on our guard. I'm sorry for that, but that's the state that we've come to. About the only time we can watch or listen to anything and not be entirely on our guard is maybe if we're sitting next to a gentle river or watching and listening to the water. That's about the only thing I know of left out there that's true, that we can watch and listen to without being on our guard. So, me personally, yeah, I would say, for the most part, the greater part, stay away from the conspiratorial focused sources, because more often than not, they're gatekeepers. They are meant to actually take you further off course than if you just would have went to establishment sources and you know, rolled up your sleeves and read it on guard and did all you could to try to pick apart what they're claiming, what they're telling us, whether or not it's true. Now, following a lot of those caveats, and of course there's going to be caveats, and there's going to be a lot of caveats in my video. You know why? I'll tell you why. Because of everything I just said. Because we can't trust anything. What can you trust? Why don't you tell me in the comments what source you find trustworthy? That's the problem. There has to be caveats to information, or I could say things that were misleading. Unless I know something, I can't just say fact, 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 fact. And if I present things as facts, I better be pretty darn sure of them, or I might be acting irresponsibly. And unfortunately, because I'm fallible, you have to pay attention to my rhetoric too, to make sure I'm not misspeaking. So, one of the things that have caused this this current state of just not knowing even what I can present to you has been almost an overload of information. So many factors in so many places. Bits and pieces, loose ends, they're all over the place. And sometimes someone such as myself won't know exactly how to tie all of them together neatly. That's why a lot of things I present can be a little bit sloppy, because I don't think that there is enough information currently available to honest researchers to make those good, solid connections. So you just have to go with what you got. I will tell you, some of the strangest information, besides how fast they claimed that railroads were installed in the United States, and you could even say that throughout Europe as well, mind-bogglingly fast. Mind-bogglingly fast. Compared to really all of the upheaval that seemed to be going on for all of those years, that so much rail was said to be installed in just, well, let's say North America. Amazing. Besides that, I keep running into all of these really strange anomalies of things that happened mostly between the years of World War I and World War II. More development, like significant development, like infrastructure significant development, like, on the scale of unbelievable, that happened just between World War I and World War II. Amazing. Really. A lot of this is actually dams, because I'm compiling this just enormous list of dams just in the United States. And how many of them impressive projects were said to have been built in this time, or were said to have been built during the Great Depression. And not just dams, lock and dam projects, large building projects that don't make any sense, mostly during that time. It's really very odd. Very odd. I know a lot of things are claimed to have been built in the 1800s, like the railroads, and a lot of structures, a lot of cities that they say were built up pretty massively in the 1800s, because the 1800s is such a catch-all. But wow, the amount of just construction projects done between the periods of World War I and World War II, when we were losing so many grown, able-bodied men, for one thing. It's amazing. Like, it seems like it just defies logic. So let me give you some examples from Holt here, and how very little has changed in, well, I guess some of her early examples are from the late 1800s, so whatever, we'll say 130, 140 years, 150 years, because some of these are supposed to have, of course, happened before this. Guys like Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, other prominent writers do factor into all of this, and prominent publications. Now, she says, and I'll go ahead and do that, borrow for 1 hour, and here at archive.org, we'll do our little book borrow for 1 hour, because I believe this is the exact copy I have. So we'll just take you right up here to page 10. Go full screen. All right. On page 10, now this concerns the propaganda. So she spends, and of course she's not really calling it propaganda, but you can tell it's very strongly, it's meant to propagandize maybe the unaffected onlooker, probably the demographic who were the most affected, maybe more than anything. Because as we'll see, this is, when we see the demographic mostly affected, we're going to see just how widespread it is, and therefore how widespread the propaganda had to be. And if we just translate this more into radio dramas, I suppose, of the early 1900s, then of course all of our television, movie, video dramas of, modern day, we can see not much has changed, really. So she says on page 10, the orphan image drew warm sympathies when viewed through the pages of a book or magazine. There were no harsh realities to intrude. Sometimes, however, truth met fiction. In 1894, Alger's orphan character Julius the Street Boy, so this Alger is Horatio Alger, and he was one of the most prolific authors writing about orphans. She talks about him a little here. Now, I looked into Horatio Alger, and he does not sound like a very good guy. There are some serious allegations that appeared to exist about this guy and his, in quotes, love of children. So let me move forward here. In 1894, Alger's orphan character, Julius, the street boy, left the squalor of New York's tenements in the company of other children. They were headed for a new life on the Western Plains. The story was fiction, but means of Julia's immigration was a real-life organization, the well-known New York Children's Aid Society. As Alger explained his character's circumstances, quote, Julius, ... goes west in one of the companies which are sent out periodically under the auspices of the Children's Aid Society, an admirable association, close quote. With his immigration, Julius would have the opportunities to become a self-made man, one of the, quote, respected, prosperous citizens, ... of the West, closed quote. So you have this dramatizing of real events, which, as we can see from extracting bits and pieces from Marilyn Irvin Holt that she doesn't, of course, want to expose to us just how widespread the harshness of all of this actually was. But look, you have people like this Horatio Alger and others that I just mentioned, not only glorifying the drama of the orphan, but certainly isolating individual orphans in their dramas, making these things very anecdotal when it was epidemic. And as I said, you had them doing this then to minimize the terrible situation, epidemic situation for at least 75 years, U.S. and Europe. Now, Holt goes on to say, the particular experience of the literary orphan Julius was in reality duplicated by thousands of boys and girls, the true orphans, street waifs, and indigents of America's poorer classes. What literature portrayed was, in a larger context, a keystone to 19th century views of children and childhood and what could be done to, quote, reward, to save the children of the poor. Now, I'll go on to read a little bit more by Holt just following this on the next page or two so that you can understand why they are dramatizing these events and who in particular are their targets and how they use them, how they used them then, and how they use them now. And now it would seem in an even more insidious way, but maybe not. Maybe nothing has really changed, except just the details a little bit. On page 11 at the bottom, she goes on to say, discussions about children and childhood created by the mid-19th century a general consensus of what Americans believed children to be. Early in the century, there were still remnants of 18th century thought that clung to the idea of all children as sinners. All children as sinners. You know, like in that theology that espouses original sin all children as sinners. Right. In literature such as the 1818 series, The History of the Fairchild Family, children were most often portrayed with, quote, wicked hearts, requiring large doses of strict Christian training. There were also those who stood by the Reverend Jonathan Edwards' edict that children were, quote, not too little to die, not too little to go to hell, closed quote. Good old Jonathan Edwards, known popularly and beloved in Christian circles as the author of, for one thing, a pamphlet, a sermon put into a pamphlet entitled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Good old Jonathan Edwards. Now, I'll skip over a bit more in this particular paragraph where she said there were debates over the nature of children and so on and so forth, but we really need to look at the treatment of the children and this demographic, which I will cite to you before I'm done here. She goes on to say, as long as the people believed that predestination decided life's outcome, there was little one could do in changing one's circumstances and character. Child rearing and education focused on the repression of the great evil that lurked in each soul. Now she goes on in the next paragraph, and this is the very, very important tactic. It's the very important tactic that we need to recognize as being their key to making so many things work then and now. The purity of children became an increasingly powerful theme in American thought, as reflected in the literature of the day, and it fell to the mother within the family unit to protect this innocent with, quote, those lessons of virtue and wisdom which are not of this world. Children were dependent on the adults around them for direction and instruction, with what scholars have today termed the cult of true womanhood. Society's dictated role for women in their sphere of domesticity. There came to exist a cult of the child. This recognition of childhood dictated that children were different from adults and gave a whole set of standards by which the quality of a child's experiences were judged. If women were to be the mainstays of home and the defenders of respectability, guidelines had to exist for their roles as protectors of children. Child rearing demanded thought and creativity. In the ideal household, the child would follow the example and teaching of the mother, and she in turn would encourage deference to the perfect father. She would encourage deference to the perfect father. This is all propaganda being directed at the women, the mothers of children, but specifically the women, and especially of this particular demographic. So what is deference? Submission to or compliance with the will, wishes, etc. of another. What did she say that the women were being encouraged to do? Do you remember that? In the ideal household, the child would follow the example and teaching of the mother, and she in turn would encourage deference to the perfect father. That's exactly how anything insidious or successful is done against any people, is by weakening the father's role, whether they convince the father that it's too much work to stay with this intemperate, unsatisfied, mouthy woman, and they create the children and they run away, or whether they just simply encourage behaviors that turn the father into a weak, pussy-ass beta. Whatever it is that they do, they remove the power from the father, the power of being the leader, the power of being the one who says, this is the final decision. I have heard the arguments, the perspectives in my home, and I am making the final decision, and it stands. Now you see, a strong father could say that today. However, he better know that when he says that the state is ready and poised, and not just the state, but of course, culture, the state, culture, social media, everything is ready and poised to get behind that woman, to get behind that mother and crush him. They've been working on women and mothers for at least 150 years. That's exactly how they keep men of a certain demographic, at least, weak, ineffectual, maybe many demographics. The problem is, and I don't mean maybe in a flippant way, I mean the focus of this book is more on certain demographics, though, again, Holt downplays this as much as she has to admit it, and I will show you that. She downplays it. She turns it around on those demographics who were most victimized, and you'll know why as soon as I show you who the demographics are. You'll know exactly why she turns the tables on them repeatedly, making the very small other demographics, in a sense, far more victimized than this overwhelming demographic, which I'm going to show you right now. Now, as much as Holt does try to mitigate this fact, it does show up over and over and over again as being the overall, 90% or more overall, and usually up above 90% demographic throughout all of this, in Europe and in America. But I'll just read this to you on page 69, starting at the bottom of page 69. It has been estimated, however, that within the 30-year period of 1860 to 1890, as many as 94% of the placements were of American-born or German, English, or Irish immigrant children. And you can say that sounds a little lighter and fluffier than something very harsh, as in they were mostly of German, English, or Irish descent, so-called, because I certainly don't believe that in any of those European countries that they are some sort of absolutely homogeneous ethno-state, per se. There are different tribes there. Any country. What we see is this little clip of a 30-year that she admits that it was 94%, but if one pays attention as they read through the rest of the book, as I have, at least up until I'm on page 125 right now, 124, 125, that demographic is constantly represented as the highest. Essentially, we're talking about the poor slave class people from predominantly Germany, England, and Ireland, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're also talking about a bit from Brittany, which is Celtic portion of northern France, maybe some in Wales, the English Midlands. There's a reason why the term yeoman is used. And why Low German. And why there is, and we know there was, a strong distinction between the landed gentry in Ireland and all these countries with very similar forms of government, and with monarchs, at least from the 17 and 1800s, that were all related. At least monarchs and aristocracies. There was a sharp difference between the landed gentry and the low people of these places. So if you know that these demographics, and I say these like it's a plural, but it sounds more like this, since I've also found out since my last video, I'm not sure if I've even mentioned this before, that the older histories that they try to pass off as like Greek and Roman historians and so on and so forth, often regarded the Germanic and the Gaul as both Celts, same people. So you figure, who were the low class of these countries for the most part? Well, this demographic. And no one out there has to make them out to be Israel and Judah or anything like that. If you don't want, that's fine. I'm simply stating a fact that the people in power today seem to have a particular need to keep these demographics far away from even the potential of power, even the potential of knowledge. They seem to have a particular bent towards doing so. And if that's the case, and the by far overwhelming demographic of these orphans were so-called German, Irish, English, the low class of these countries, then you can bet that a good deal of the propaganda was directed towards them. A good deal of the propaganda making the women believe that they were the righteous parties in the house, and that the men the good father needed to exercise deference, and that the children deferred to the mother for their morality, not ultimately the father. We can see a pattern here, a pattern of control, of controlling certain people in certain ways that they still do today. They absolutely target women and women's emotions and women's emotional experience, knowing that the women have the ability through a number of means. If there's no children, women will use their abilities as far as seductive abilities, or just the fact that men want to be affirmed by a woman. My opinion, but if they are a masculine man, they want to be affirmed by a woman. So a woman has a lot of power simply because this man wants to be affirmed by this woman. That affirmation can come through the woman being looking pretty, keeping herself nice looking in her body, being complimentary to this man, flirting with him, deferring to him in matters of knowledge and understanding. This can come sexually. There are a number of ways that this affirmation can come. So women have that sort of power. And if there's children, and those men love their children, and I can only imagine, based on how much I love mine, that is a shitload of power that woman has. These are non-linear warfare tactics that we're talking about. They're non-linear warfare tactics. They are subtly controlling the women so that the women will control the men. Now, that's not to say that, women are the absolute bad guys or anything like that. That is not. I'm saying there is an order. If you want a people to be strong, there is an order that needs to be followed. And that does not include the women making the final decisions for everything. It does not involve, actually, and Holt goes on again to very, I think, downplay, but does let us know that essentially all kinds of publications that were being put out as propaganda to these women were essentially telling them that they were the absolute arbiter of their children's morality, and how important it was that they were this great absolute arbiter to their children's morality, and that it was the man, the husband and man's father's job and duty to go and work himself silly to provide a certain standard of life, so that this woman could be the ultimate one who was setting the standards for the morality for, which basically what it came down to was these publications would tell the women, these wives and mothers and such, what the moral standards and guidelines should be in an entertaining or an emotionally arousing way, so that they would follow their advice, and they would do everything they could to keep the fathers working endlessly, so that they were constantly tired and drained. Their energy, they didn't have energy to fight in their own home. They didn't have energy to fight in their own home. Is this sounding familiar? Was this just 150 years ago? 200 years ago? 50 years ago? Or was it 5 minutes ago? It's insane the amount of propaganda that went on, and it is entirely believable, and it runs concurrent with reality. Who they aimed the propaganda at, and why, and in so doing removed more children from their families than I, having read half this book, more than half this book now, can even begin to get my head around. The numbers are catastrophic, the numbers that exist. And again, and again, and again, I have to say, the numbers that weren't kept track of are likely far higher exponentially than the ones that actually were. Now, this, of course, is not everything that there is to say about Holt's orphan trains. And I don't want anybody to think, for one thing, that I think only the slave class of Germany, England, Ireland have had it bad. A lot of people have had it bad for a long time. A lot of people, a lot of demographics have had it bad for a long time. And the reason for this is so that other demographics, a certain minority, and I don't mean like societal minority, I mean an invisible minority, okay? So that a certain minority can have it very good. Remember, the world is not a terrible place for some. It is a terrible place for, excuse me, it's a terrible place for most. But there is a certain segment of living humanity that life is just pretty good for. What are they going to complain about? Are they going to complain because they have to spend their lives in the pursuit of making sure that they have 1,000 slaves for each one of their individual people? No. I'm not entertaining the sword of Damocles in this context. Life is bad for most because life is good for the least some, the invisible few. And when I say few, you got to figure that's quite a big number. If there are 7 to 8 billion people in the world, the few is a big number. Not good. But things are what they are. And if they are what they are what they are for a good reason. And if God, if Yahweh is in control, everything is as it is because he ordained it to be. He didn't sit back and say, well, let's see how they do it. Maybe if I have to stop things or curtail them. He can't be omniscient and not know, as in ordain this state. There's got to be some answers. I just think that they are answers the likes of which we have not performed, maybe haven't entered into our mind, but there has to be answers. Because I can't even imagine this sort of thing happening again. And unfortunately, I see all the signs of something very big happening that was very similar to what happened 100 years ago, around the time of the so-called First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. Maybe not the same and in the same ways, but the factors, they're there, they exist. I don't want to see that happen. So I hope enough of us are able to do things different. We can't keep doing things the same way, or things are going to keep going the same way. The same people are going to stay in power, and the same people are going to stay at the bottom. And it's not just these demographics I named here. The so-called German, English, or Irish. You know, there's tons of demographics that we're all connected. Nobody's an island. No demographics is an island. For better or worse, we are connected. The fate of one is tied to the fate of another. Demographics are used. People types, whether they're ethnicities within a race or whether they're races, are used by these people who fully intend to retain power and continue to proliferate. Demographics and races are used, I think, heavily on this demographic here, but they're used one against another. They're used one against another. The reason I say that is because it would appear that this demographic here, this so-called German, English, Irish, are possibly what they see them as maybe the most immediate threat. And that's why they have taken the measures that they have for a long time now against them. Using racial conflicts and using a lot of lies about other races, lies about themselves. Nobody wins except a small amount of people who are currently in control and likely have been in control for a couple of centuries now. That's who's been winning. Nobody else wins. And I don't think anybody else is going to win unless we do things completely differently. Completely change around our thinking. Willing to drop all of our misconceptions, our preconceptions about everything. Get rid of our desires. Throw them out the window. We like the way that this story sounds. It feels good. Then I would be very cautious to believing that, going along with it, and adjusting my behavior to those beliefs, because they're likely just desires, wants. You got sold a dream. I got sold a dream. Nothing can be too sacred to be examined in the shrewdest way possible. With that, I'm going to stop preaching. I'm at 1 minute, and I didn't even mean to do that, but like, we have to hear this. We've got to hear it. We've got to hear it in our own minds, you know, and if not, we have to hear it out loud from somebody else so that it resonates in our own minds. There you go. So with that, I will see you in the next one. Send me an email if you want to get added to an email list. More things are coming as regularly as I can. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.